Hello everybody and welcome to ChessDiagnostic. This is Andrew and we are on part 2 of how I won $12,000 playing chess. So this is the final of the Millionaire Monday 2016, and in part 1 I covered the semifinal. We played 2 games, I won both games, so I made it to the final out of 4 players. Those other 2 players are playing, I think, for an $1,800 and a $3,200 prize. So we were playing for $6,000 and $12,000. So I knew I was going to win some money at this point. We both kind of relaxed, although I really wanted to win just to kind of prove myself since I had made it there. And I'm black, and I was playing against Jagpreet Singh. Now, Jagpreet Singh had played very well. He won both of his games as well in the semifinal, and he won almost every game in the under 2000 section. So I knew he was really gunning for first place. He came all the way from India. Let's see what happened here. So I'm black. He started with e4, c5, knight to f3, e6, d4 takes, knight takes, and then with a6, I went for my standard Sicilian con. Now, I made a game video that I played against Grandmaster Shaposhnikov where I checkmated him in one move, and that covered how Shaposhnikov really outplayed my Sicilian con with a queenside expansion. Now, because of that game, I've really been reevaluating my Sicilian repertoire, and I think I'm going to start playing the Najdorf, but I really do like the Sicilian con, and at this level it's okay because it's very solid. But I fear that as I go higher, I'll be outplayed in this very otherwise solid opening. So knight to c3, queen to c7, preparing bishop to b4, bishop to e2, bishop to b4, and then castles. Now, I could have won a pawn, but it's actually very dangerous. I had played a game about 2 months earlier against an 1800 player, and they almost won because I took the pawn, my queen's a little exposed, and now white gets easy development, and he really controls the dark squares. So I decided not to go for that line and just develop my knight, preparing to castle with knight to f6. Queen moves forward, developing my knight. He takes. I took with the d pawn, preparing e5, and to develop my light square bishop along this diagonal here. And then he plays f4, signaling some aggressive intentions. Now, I could have played e5. I just castle and let him play it himself. A slightly dubious idea, but nevertheless, the computer still rates it as equal. And after the bishop takes, white makes a slight inaccuracy, doubling his pawns. Although I understand the idea is to play c4 and control that d5 square for my knight, I activate my rook with a tempo against the queen and then bring my knight over. He plays c4, chasing my knight back. Bishop forward, and now I have some cramped queenside pieces. My idea is to play c5 and then b6 after moving my rook and activating my light square bishop along that powerful a8 to h1 diagonal. Now, he really should have played something like f5 or c5 immediately, preventing this plan, but he misses it, and he brings his bishop out, allowing me to play c5. So I felt good about at this point in the game, and after b6, I'm doing okay. His dark square bishop really has nothing to do, and it's really a horrible bishop at this point. After my bishop's active, I felt that I could play in the center and just try to prevent a kingside attack by white. Now I established my queen on c6, just making some threats and also preventing something like g4. A slightly better idea might have been to bring the knight in, but I decided to put my queen on c6 and bring my knight to f5, where if he took with his light square bishop, all he'd be left with would be his dark square bishop, which is bad. Alright, so he plays a4, maybe preparing or preventing a queenside expansion of my own. And now we see knight to f5, attacking the queen, and he doesn't take with his bishop, which I understood. If he takes, then I'll simply take here, and after g6, he really doesn't have, I don't have any problems. I have a much stronger bishop, and with the opposite colors, and the queen's still on the board, I might even get a very strong attack. So he doesn't allow that. He plays queen to h3. I reinforce that knight, and now it's still equal at this point. So with queen to g4, he's planning something like bringing the h-pawn in, and I just start doubling my rooks, preventing h5, but he plays it anyway, and now he gets some f5 break, moving my rook. Now the danger is moving his e-pawn and establishing that dark square bishop. I move my knight back, threatening that bishop, and then I blockade the pawn with the knight. It's still equal at this point, but he starts to go wrong slightly, thinking he can get a kingside attack, but he really has nothing, and I simply take the pawn. Now black is slightly better because I have an extra pawn. His bishops aren't active, and he really has no chances on the king side. Kind of exploiting this idea, I could have taken that rook, but it would have been a mate in 3 after he simply moves this pawn in. And now the only move is knight to e2 to prevent checkmate. Bishop takes, and there's nothing I can do. Even if he takes here, we'll simply get checkmate. So I didn't allow that, of course, but now his rook's going to become active. I move my queen back, knight forward, and now actually I'm almost winning at this point. I could have traded queens. Actually, no, that doesn't work because the pawn would have been threatening my rook, and then he keeps the bishop. So I had to take with the pawn, it looks like, and then queen moves back. I blockade the pawn again. He can take, and here's where I'm not proud of. This is pretty much the only blunder in this match, but it's a horrendous blunder. I wanted to take the pawn on e5, and I should have done that, but I quickly calculated that he can take here, so I didn't allow that. But what I could have done was simply play a5, and this extra pawn would have decided. These two weak pawns are practically worthless. I have this strong bishop. His bishop is really not doing anything, and my rooks can come into play very quickly. I can back this passed pawn and push it just to cause problems on the queen side, and I would have been winning at this point. Instead, I played rook to d8, hallucinating that my bishop was covering the square. He stared at it for about 30 seconds, and then finally realized that I just gave him a rook. He took, and after a few more moves, it's over. I resigned because he's going to trade the bishops and practically be up a rook for nothing, and it was just over. So I resigned at this point and had lost the first game. So I felt horrible, but I knew I was better at this point. I knew I was better in this game. I knew I had outplayed him, but it really gave me a fire in my belly to play better in the second one. So let's go to the second game. All right, this is on Chess24. So they did live stream all these games on Chess24. So just a quick story in the second game. I had talked to his opponent that he played, and he told me what he played as black, which he said he plays the Sicilian dragon. So I quickly looked up a line that was very aggressive and not really in theory. So I had something prepared, and this is really the reason that I won these games. But I also outplayed him in some endings. So let's see what happens. I'm white. I play e4, c5. And as soon as I saw c5, I knew he was going to play what he normally plays. He wasn't going to deviate. So we get the Sicilian dragon with g6. I was very excited to see this. And now I played bishop to g5. And I could tell he didn't recognize this move. And I was very happy because this is a very aggressive line with the double bishop deployment. It's very simple. Knight comes in, queen to e2, and then I castle queenside. Now, the strength of this line is that black really doesn't have the same dynamic chances as in other lines, since he allowed this line. And I have a lot of attacking possibilities, as well as playing f4, brings his knight up, f4, and then I bring my knight back. He should have taken it, but after simply e5, This pawn can't take. The knight comes back, and now I'm actually winning at this point. I take, and I should have just simply took with the bishop, getting a fork. But instead, I made a slight error, taking with the queen. But at this point, I win an exchange, and I knew I could win it. So I felt like at this point, as long as I play solidly, I'll be able to even the score and push the final match into overtime, pretty much. All right, so I'm going to activate my knight. I didn't want the bishop taking and destroying my pawn structure. He threatens. Of course, I don't want to just protect this pawn. I want to be as active as possible. So in the endgame, activity rules the day. You don't want to play passive. That's the death sentence in the endgame. Knight takes, activating my knight and threatening his bishop. I take, and now after the bishop moves forward, I attack it, and he makes a horrendous blunder, taking the pawn, and I simply trap it. It's almost like that Fisher game where he gives away, or he takes a pawn, and then it just gets trapped. I didn't know why he did this, but he did, and it made it even easier to win. Now I simply attack it. A slight inaccuracy. I have to protect that knight with my rook. If I would have brought it back, black would have had some counterplay, so I wanted to just prevent that. That bishop's not going anywhere. So he thinks that he's saved that bishop, but even though he's protecting it, there's really no way that that bishop's ever getting out of its death sentence. If the pawn moves anywhere, I'll just take it, and eventually I'll trade. So I activate my rook. You can see these last two moves are very basic activity increasing moves. The rook's inactive, my least active piece. These moves are very simple, winning that pawn and threatening the bishop. The bishop is trying to save itself, but there's no hope. So I trade a piece, and we trade some moves. He really is just trying to prevent that piece from being taken. I could have just took the bishop, but I wanted to keep as much material and play as accurately as possible. Now I'm protecting that c2 pawn, and my king's ready to swing over now that the rook is taking over that duty. So he pushes his pawn, and actually I could have just simply activated my king after he goes h5. I could have just moved in here, and it looks like a checkmate would have been imminent within 10 moves. But instead, I decided to break up his pawn structure with h4. And then after these moves, I decided to just play very basically. Now, this isn't the most accurate, obviously. I could have just went for mate, but I wanted to trade down material and move very quickly. I didn't want to spend a lot of time calculating and leave anything to chance. So my king's going to come back. His king has to stay back because of my rook, limiting it. Now I threaten the bishop, and he's going to win that piece for a pawn, but I start limiting his king and going for mate. Checking his king after a double attack on that bishop, comes back, and now after threatening mate, I pin that bishop, win it, and we get these moves here. It's all over. And ironically, he resigned one move before mate. Didn't want to allow me to do that. He was livid that he wasn't able to hold a draw and win. And now we were equal. So we're going into overtime here. I was very happy that I had beat him. It was as white though. Let me try to fix that so you don't always see the end position. All right, so I'm black again, and we just traded Sicilians, it looks like. I play c5, e6, we get the same con, and I decided to alter my strategy. I knew I wasn't going to take on c3 because I knew he had something prepared against me, and so, because when a player is doing that, normally they'll have some very strong line. I could just tell. So I decided to play very solidly, develop my knights, and keep my bishop within my kingside position. Playing d6, castles, activating his bishop, takes, And now I get to play e5, as I wanted to play in the previous game. So I'm threatening, obviously, the fork, very obvious threat. And he moves his knight forward. Now it's equal at this point. I could have simply took with the bishop, and I would have actually had a slightly better position. Instead, I made a tactical error, taking here. And now, after these trades, I finally saw that I can't take this pawn. I thought I could take it, but the problem is, if the king takes, then after bishop to b5, my king is suddenly driven out into the open, and it becomes very dangerous. Again, I'm not trying to go for complications, even if it might have been better, even though that's not better at all. So after the pawn takes, the rook and the queen can't take because they'll be pinned with bishop to d5, for example, queen, and then it's all over. So I had to move my king over. He solidifies that extremely dangerous pass pawn, and I wasn't feeling good at this point. I thought maybe I'd lose it, but I tried to play as actively as possible. Again, queen moves over, trying to keep my bishop active. Now, I really don't want to play something like bishop here because he can eventually move these pawns over, and I can't move this pawn because he'll take, and there's no way to activate my king. He can just simply run these pawns, attack my bishop. If I push this pawn, it becomes weak, and he can take. So I wanted to keep my bishop on the side and allow myself to, again, you can see he's moving his pawns, but now I can play g6. We trade. Bishop threatens the rook. He moves back. And here I come up with an idea to activate my king. I knew I had to do something fast. It actually says white is only slightly better, although practically this is a very difficult position to play. So my idea that I came up with very quickly was rook here, protecting the pawn. I'll play b6 and a5 to protect everything. I'll move this rook to the d8. I'll move my bishop back to blockade the pawn, and then I'll get my king out to the center. So that was my plan to get as active as possible. And that's exactly what I did. Protecting that pawn, bishop back, and now I'm in a much better position. He could have prevented it by bringing his rook over and preventing my king from getting in. That would have been a good idea. But we don't see that. Even though white is much better at this point, I'm still active and still in the game. So I'm trying to break through. Maybe not the best plan, but I wanted to keep active. Controlling my 8th and 7th rank. I take. And here I make a blunder. Rook to b4. Now I did have a plan to sack and to win this pawn. But actually white could have played here. And now the threat of rook to e8 wins this bishop, and I would have lost. So my opponent saw that one move too late. He plays here. He was preparing to invade my 8th rank or my 7th rank, and now I have a chance to sack and win the pawn. So it's actually equal at this point again after he trades, but I felt I had practical winning chances because of those two very strong center connected pass pawns and my bishop. He takes, and practically this is a very difficult ending to defend as white, because I'm just going to run these pawns in, defend any checks with my bishop, and use my king and bishop to support these pawns. And that's exactly what I did. Just kept moving forward, and there were multiple opportunities for him. Let's go back just as an example. So if he would have played something like king, saying king to d2, although even then, yeah, he's just lost at this point. Even the computer, its evaluation is going crazy, but it sees that it's lost at this point. So I check him, and it's all over. After check, the bishop's gonna go here, and then I missed a mate in 2 after I turned the queen. I could have just did a double check and then checkmate. But we were playing very fast at this point. You can see we ended up with 8 seconds to 36. But after here, I simply took and then solidified that. And my plan was just to quickly run my king over and usher this pawn in and checkmate. So I had won 2 games in a row. And we're going to go to the last game here. Oh, all right. So this is the game that finally won me $12,000. It was Jagpreet Singh. He's a nice guy, but I could tell he was very angry at this point because he had let slip a winning position as white. And now I was white. And what he should have done was alter his strategy. He should have played a different opening. But he fell into the exact same trap. I'm sure he has won many Sicilian Dragon games against weaker opponents, but he fell into the same line, did the same thing, but he played slightly better. This time, though, I went immediately into the endgame as soon as I could, because I knew that I would be able to outplay him in any endgame. He seemed to not be very good at defense, so I made that judgment to try to trade as many pieces as possible. Some inaccuracies, and now I offer a queen trade. He takes, and it's equal at this point. So even though it's equal, I have a good feeling about it because, as you can see, my bishop, my 2 rooks are a lot more active. His pawns are even blocking his bishop. He has nothing to do. Already, he's made a slight inaccuracy. I take. He's trying to activate his pieces. And now after a trade, I'm going to win a pawn at least. Just activating my pieces. But now after the rook to e8, he does have some threats. He's threatening simply mate here. I had to think here for a little bit of what to do. I can't really just bring my rook in because then he'd mate me. He's also threatening to bring his rook to e2 and win some pawns. So I came up with knight back, which solves all my problems. Now if he moves rook to e2, I move my rook back, and the knight's also covering the e1 square, so he can't mate me. I couldn't move my king because he would just take that pawn, and also that knight is covering the pawn. Chasing his knight back, activating my king, offering a rook trade. I really just wanted to trade all my pieces and usher in my extra pawn. Trading. And I felt I was winning at this point, even though the computer says white is just much better. But I felt I had much better practical chances with that extra pawn. And he really makes a mistake bringing his king over here because there's no way for him to break through. Moving his pawns forward. And now that extra pawn decides the game. Alright, so I accidentally flicked to another game. So here's this, the ending of this game. He tries to break through with g3. I need to be careful not to take here. Then he'll get something like, well, either way. So I just took, and he tries to trade, but after I trade, he resigned because he realized that even if he takes here, my rook will come back, or I can even queen the pawn. And if he takes with his king, then after here, I just have too many pawns, and there's nothing to do. So this was the end. I outplayed him in, looks like 3 endgames, although the middle game, the early opening errors that he made in the dragon decided these games. It was a very fun final to play. It was quite exciting. And actually, after I won, I couldn't really believe it. I thought, oh, it's crazy. I didn't think that I was going to win this section. But it felt good, and I hope to continue my chess advancement to get to National Master. I feel like I've played at that level for quite a while, since about 2012. I just don't play active enough. But when I do play actively and I feel good about going to a tournament, then normally I'll play pretty well. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed these games, trying to explain my thought process. They were rapid games, but I do remember quite vividly the thoughts I had during the game, and it was interesting to see how they came to fruition during the game and in the match. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you in the future. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe for future videos. See you in the future.